Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us with E3G again to dissect what's happening here at COP28. We have a couple of our experts on the line today to answer your questions around how the COP28 negotiations are going. My name is Alex Scott, and I will give you a bit of an overview of the big picture, which often comes down to finance. So how the finance negotiations are going and the broader finance architecture reform politics that started on a high at the start of COP28, but hasn't necessarily carried through into the negotiating rooms. Today, we have been mostly playing a bit of a waiting game as the consultations have gone to ministerial level and behind a lot of closed doors, but spent the time constructively dissecting the draft global stocktake text and some of the other texts that have come out today. And we have our energy and adaptation experts on the line to answer your questions as well. I'll hand over to Lisa to introduce herself and then straight into Anna. Lisa, over to you.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Fischer, and I've been following the negotiations around the energy package in the GST. So happy to answer any questions around that. Just one line similar to what Alex said, we now have another iteration of text where a lot of the elements that have been proposed by parties are in there, and it's really now about stitching them together into something coherent that makes sense and maintains ambition and also links to both finance and implementation across the different negotiation strands. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And please do ask us your questions. Please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom or also onto the chat function. If you'd like to raise a hand and come in and ask a question verbally, you're more than welcome to do so. Please just raise a hand. But over to Anna to introduce yourself and a quick take on where adaptation stands at the moment.
Hi, Alex. Hi, I'm Anna, and I am the Adaptation and Loss and Damage Researcher at E3G. I've been following the operationalization of the new Loss and Damage Fund and the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, which now has kind of wrapped up. And we're following now more closely the Global Goal on Adaptation, which should come to fruition by the end of the COP. So happy to take any questions on this.
Thanks, Anna. And actually, the first question is right back to you. Where do things stand at the moment on that global goal and adaptation text? Please let us know.
Right. So the global goal and adaptation framework, which is what is being negotiated at this COP, it's a tool for stakeholders, like parties, communities, to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability to climate change. This is set out by the Paris Agreement. There is agreement then on the purpose of the goal, but there is disagreement on whether it should include overarching targets and then smaller targets on dimensions of the adaptation policy cycle or around themes, whether indicators should be developed, and whether principles such as CBDR should be included. Also, there's debate on whether means of implementation will be embedded into the text. So we don't really know exactly the shape that the document will have yet, and I think this is something that COP facilitators have struggled in the negotiations. So it really is very unclear right now in terms of the status of the negotiations. So parties during week one tried to engage in the text. However, the text that was proposed by the COP facilitators was not up to their standards. Parties didn't feel like their options were reflected in the text. So even though we had two different iterations of the text, parties never actually got to engage in it. They were blocked to do so by the Arab group and LMDCs, who really were adamant that the text was not appropriate, and now it's in the hands of the presidency and the ministers to draft this text and find agreement on it. But like I said, the actual structure of the text should have something like purpose and scope, but then also some sort of overarching target with smaller targets underneath. But what that would look like, it's in particular is very hard to say at this point.
Thanks, Anna. Maybe to add a little bit to that, I think the goal itself is already set in the Paris Agreement. It's what Anna was saying about increasing adaptive capacity and improving resilience of communities. That's the goal in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. What we're really talking about here is how we measure whether we're on track for that goal and building a bit of an investment plan around actually achieving the goal. You know, we have a pretty clear way of knowing whether we're on track for limiting warming below 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. We can measure that through total carbon emissions. But at the moment, we don't have a shared framework for how we measure whether we are improving adaptive capacity and resilience of communities. So this is about setting the baseline and understanding how we can track and therefore drive more political pressure to increase adaptation, because none of us are safe from climate impacts, even at 1.5 degrees at the moment. 1 in 6 countries don't even have an adaptation plan or framework at the national level. And the IPCC reports this year showed that most of the adaptation effort that countries are undertaking is really planning, it's not implementing. So the purpose of this goal is of defining that measurement framework is to have the state of play that drives political attention and pushes countries to take more action on adaptation. We have a few more questions coming in. Damien in particular is interested to know from you, Lisa, about the state of play regarding phase out of fossil fuels and how the OPEC letters leak is significant or not, what the COP28 official Twitter account retweeting Annalena Baerbock's tweet calling for phase out means. Damien from the Guardian is keen to hear your take on that, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Damien. So maybe briefly on the state of play, we came out of week 1 in more broadly on the energy package with a sort of strong surround sound and support for tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency and support for fossil fuel phase out. 130 countries signing up to a pledge, and a lot of statements also over the last few days, on Friday in particular, from AOSIS, from Colombia, from even including from the US on fossil fuel phase out. So we've had that set up. We've also seen a lot of pressure on Al Jaber on sort of his potential conflict of interest, and the need for him to really focus on delivering a high ambition outcome. I feel like now what we've seen with the text coming out yesterday, that I think he's heard that in the sense that he's made sure some progressive options are on the table, and what parties have said, largely speaking, is included. Now his role doesn't end there. He will need to continue to ensure that there is scope for an ambitious outcome, honest brokering, that any attempts to kind of water down language on fossil fuel phase out isn't just sort of passed or passed through. So we'll see with the potential next iteration of the text how he's consolidating some of the different options, but in particular there's one that calls for the phase out of fossil fuels in line with 1.5 and best available science. I think this is one that there is potential for support from the progressives as well. In terms of your looking back at your question, sorry, I think the OPEC letter, I think, is significant in the sense that it is continuing to show that there are interests trying to water down language on fossil fuels, and it's important for Al Jaber, sort of draws the baseline. He needs to distinguish himself from this group of countries, otherwise he cannot be seen as an honest broker. So I think it is significant in this regard. I'm not sure I can comment on your second question because I haven't actually followed that in detail, so I'll pass back here to Alex and any further questions on the energy package.
Thanks, Lisa. I've followed the tweet. I think it was interesting. Baerbock was tweeting particularly that we can't just have a goal about phasing out the emissions of fossil fuels. What we really need to be talking about is phasing out all fossil fuels. And it was retweeted by the COP28 official Twitter account or official X account, whatever we're calling it now. I think, to be very fair, I have not been tracking the COP28 accounts retweeting, so can't work out whether that's particularly significant comparatively, but I do think it's a reflection of the number of retweets of that tweet is a reflection of the direction of political travel towards really having a concrete fossil fuel phase out outcome from COP28. We've got another question following up on what you were saying, Anna, on the global goal on adaptation. Could you give us a bit of an overview of why you think the Arab group and LMDCs are pushing back and dismissing the text that's on the table?
Yes, they really emphasize that their views were not represented. Like I responded to someone else. The COP facilitators made a bit of a strategic leap by creating a convergence text from the very beginning without spelling out options from the different groups. And developing countries, but particularly the Arab group and LMDCs, felt like their options were not reflected, that the text was very unbalanced. In particular, what their issue was a lack of mention of equity, particularly CBDR, and the lack of means of implementation also in the text. They argue that a text without or targets without means of implementation is toothless, cannot be truly implemented. So in regards whether they are trying to gain leverage on other negotiation tracks, that is definitely an option. We don't have proof. This is all conjecture. But we do know what their stance is in other areas of the package, and there is always a risk of parties trying to leverage different parts for another. We hope this is not the case, and we hope that they can really reach an agreement that creates a framework to, like Alex said, assess the progress of adaptation. There is really a huge gap in adaptation finance, in adaptation planning and implementation. And this COP will not solve that whole issue, but it should at least put us in the path to get in there eventually.
Thanks, Anna. And we've got another question following up on the fossil fuel language in particular. Lisa, could you give us your take on, we know that Saudi Arabia has pushed back quite strongly on the fossil fuel language, but what about India? Is their concern more around coal, or where is India on the negotiations over the energy package at the moment?
Thank you. So I think it's important to recall that India was the country that last year introduced the fossil fuel phase-out language. At that time, it didn't enter the text, but we had around 80 countries rallying behind that. It used its G20 presidency this year to actually champion or try and push for language around renewables, energy efficiency, and also fossil fuel phased out. Obviously on the latter not successfully, but it has actually invested quite a lot in that. It has its own interests around coal, and that they certainly play a role here. I think it's important to note that India is, for India, coal is important for energy security reasons. But on oil and gas is actually an importer. I think in that sense, it isn't well advised to necessarily align that much with Saudi Arabia. It would be more interesting for it to align with other importers in the conversation. So yeah, it's got sort of mixed interests here. I think it's probably in a watch and see position, trading off multiple things across the package. Back to you, Alex, or I can pick up the question from Mitchell, but and feel free to add.
It'd be great if you could pick up that question. I also wanted to remind people quickly that We can bring you in to ask a question verbally if you'd like to raise a hand. I won't do that because I don't know how, but our comms team is on hand to bring you in to ask your question directly. But yeah, Lisa, if you could answer the question about the finance package and how that links to what we could end up with on fossil fuel phase out, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think the finance, so the package overall is three components. It's ambition in a sense, it's finance, and it's also governance. So it's kind of how do we follow up. So these are the three things to watch, and I imagine these will also be to some extent traded off, and sort of the parties will try and find a good balance between those three aspects. I think finance is important for the energy package as a whole, not only fossil fuel phase out. And at the moment, as far as the text stands, we've seen a little bit of progress in the last iteration, but not much when it comes to actually linking finance to the energy package. But it is marginal, and I think we need to see much more. Also, in terms of the pledges from countries, we haven't. We've seen, I think, was it around 60 billion mobilized last week, but that's still not enough in terms of countries' expectations. So finance will certainly play a role, but not only for fossil fuel phase out, but for the package as a whole. I think the other thing certainly that this conversation will start off the back of that is the broader framework conditions for countries to transition away from fossil fuel, in particular the producers, in particular more vulnerable producers, that will be affected first by demand breaking away. And so I think that is probably the conversation we might get into post COP to really accelerate progress.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think worth noting as well that there is, as only complex UNFCCC climate negotiations can, there is a process complexity to this, in that the global stocktake text, the global stocktake decision is kind of structured in separate parts, where the mitigation component is separate from the means of implementation, which includes the finance component, or they haven't even decided what to call that section of the global stocktake decision yet. There are about 5 different name options. So that creates a little bit of a chessboard of interests to be managed in coming up with the final package that comes out from COP28. But definitely the reality that Lisa was talking about, that countries will need some access to finance and confidence that they can find that finance without the inflated cost of capital that many developing countries face, and in the context of having really constrained fiscal space, where many are facing massive debt burdens, where taking on further public loans to stimulate the investment that would be needed in the energy transition is a real challenge. I think it definitely makes sense that there's a need for a decision on accelerating the energy transition to come with some clarity on how that will be delivered and how countries will be supported to deliver it. I think what has been particularly interesting in the iterations of the global stocktake decisions that we've seen so far is that where we've had a lot of political momentum around much wider reforms and transformations to the finance system, we haven't seen that translate into decisions that parties are putting on the table to be taken here in this UNFCCC process. Part of that is because there's not much authority from this multilateral process onto other multilateral financing institutions. But I think we could definitely see the potential for some clearer pushes on what needs to happen in that finance system transformation. And this process is famous for creating more process. So we could definitely see the potential for hooks to follow up on the different calls for finance system reform, the agendas that have been put on the table from different parties, particularly led by developing countries, and to report back on things like the global financing framework that the UAE pulled leaders together around earlier in the Leaders Summit segment of COP28. A reminder again that if you'd like to raise a hand and come in verbally, you are more than welcome to. But I wonder if we could ask Anna to come back in as well and give us a bit of an overview of whether and how loss and damage is still being talked about in the negotiations at the moment, particularly around the global stocktake. There is a section on loss and damage in the draft global stocktake decision. And I wonder, Anna, if you could give us a bit of a take on where that conversation is at now in week 2.
Hi, sorry, Alex, I had a bit of a technical issue, but I think I'm back. Right, so we saw the new fund being set up and some exciting pledges come through. I think close to 700 million at this point. Then we saw the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, which provides technical assistance, become operational by choosing a host. And now the pieces of the loss and damage package that are left are in the GST and in the NCQG for next year. We're very pleased to see that loss and damage will have a section under the GST, which recognizes losses and damages and the importance to address them. That calls for national inventories to be taken so that we know what the state of these losses and damages are. We hope that after negotiations are done, the text will reflect that these losses and damages need to be addressed at scale, and like Alex said, not contribute to further burdens that already are harming these vulnerable countries. And we hope that as the operationalization of the fund comes through the board, that there will be a mechanism put in place for replenishment, hopefully drawing in some innovative sources of finance. And we hope to see a selection of the board actually by the end of COP. This is something that IOSIS was pushing, and we know that countries are getting ready to nominate. So lots of exciting things happening for loss and damage. In terms of NCQG, although negotiations will wrap up next year, there's already been some push to have a sub-goal for loss and damage. However, there's backlash, mainly I think from the EU. They really do not support loss and damage sub-goal in the NCQG, and I think this links back to some of the negotiations for the new fund, where developed countries really wanted to avoid liability and tying themselves to commitments that they don't think they might be able to fulfill due to perhaps internal issues and budgetary constraints. But we hope that next year, as negotiations evolve, we will see that sub-goal that is so important for vulnerable communities.
Thanks very much, Anna. And I wonder if you wanted to come in. We've had a question from Esme about how gender is coming up in negotiations in particular. I don't know if that's something that we've been following in a huge amount of detail, but in case, Anna, if there's anything you wanted to comment on that, that'd be great to hear as well.
Sorry, Alex, it cut. Are you asking about the question in the Q&A? Yeah, okay. Has a gender action plan led to a lack of focus and inclusion of gender in other areas of work, particularly loss and damage? We're actually not sure about what happened with the text on loss and damage. It included gender responsiveness, it included human rights at some point, and no one was vocal about removing those mentions. But when the take it or leave it text came out, it did not include those things. Same happened for inclusion of CSOs on the board of the new fund. So that's a bit concerning, and that for me points at some behind the scenes influencing on these negotiations against human rights and gender equality that I would have hoped we would be over by now, but here we are. And I think that just because there's a gender action plan, we need to still emphasize that in every single text that comes out because they need to be interlinked and gender needs to be embedded in everything, just like finance. So I'm hoping that we see some strong messages for gender equality and the texts that are yet to come.
Thanks very much, Anna. We'll leave it there for today, as we are sure that many of us are on our way to the High Ambition Coalition press conference that's coming up in 5 minutes in one of the main press conference venues. We'll just take a last round of concluding remarks from our E3G experts. Lisa, do you want to give us your overall take? Where do you think we're going? What are you watching over the next 24 hours?
Yeah, thanks. So as I said, all options are now on the table, which is great in terms of the energy package. The one thing, well, the couple of things to watch is, first, we are in a reality already. The IEA said that earlier this year, where fossil fuel demand will peak. So we really need to go above, peak this decade, sorry, above and beyond that ambition. And there will also be a lot about what I'll be watching about the integrity of the package in 2 dimensions. One is obviously the integrity of the fossil fuel phase out goals and any attempts to water that down, but also the integrity in the sense that people have flagged it up. Is the finance being mobilized to support parties in the right way with bringing down cost of capital, etc., and transitioning their economies to do so? But also, is the governance being set up so that the energy ambition we're getting is actually also reflected in the NDCs and in the wider ongoing GST conversation next year? That happens partly in the GST text, partly in the mitigation work program. So that's the one to look out for over the next couple of days.
Thanks, Lisa. And Anna, what's your final take for the next 24 hours?
We know that consultations are taking place. We know that they're taking place without text in front of them. So these are extremely challenging times for the presidency, but we hope that the presidency and the ministers are listening to the constituencies and really striving to find a good balance in all the positions so that there can be an actual good, strong, impactful outcome in both the GG and the remaining outcomes.
Thanks, Anna. And my final take is we are moving to a lot more of the bilateral and informal consultations. We're expecting to see the presidency bring together an informal plenary later today, where we'll get more clarity on the process from here. We're thinking there's probably going to be some text being developed overnight on the global stocktake response, and consultation starting in earnest again tomorrow. So it's not over yet. There are still options with no text in the global stocktake draft tool, and we're looking forward to seeing that turned into the real options that are actually going to address this climate crisis that we're facing, and some concrete and ambitious decisions from countries over the next couple of days, things that we can keep an eye on and report back to you again when we hold another of these press conferences in a couple of days' time, when a little bit more action has happened in the negotiations. For now, we will sign off from E3G. Thanks very much for tuning in. And if you have any questions, our experts are available. I will want to say at all hours of the day, maybe not all hours, but we'll get back to you very quickly if you email us at press@e3g.org or reply to the WhatsApp number that you might have received the WhatsApp blast with this press conference information from. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.